Okay, lesson 4 deals with reapportionment and redistricting and the issues that are associated with this process. And so we're going to delve into how we essentially divvy up the different members of the House of Representatives and the Senate in the state of Texas. So the Constitution, as we have learned, has set the amount of senators and representatives that we have in our state legislature. 31 senators, 150 House members. Now, how these are divvied up amongst the states is highly controversial. It is never a simple answer, never a simple question. And we see some of the controversy that is mirrored at the federal level here at the state level as well. The Texas Constitution requires that state legislatures reapportion seats following the federal census, and we take a federal census every 10 years, and so according to that federal census, the Texas Constitution says that the state legislature should review and reapportion the division of the senators and House members across the state to better represent the areas that are growing in population and versus the areas that are not growing in population or declining. Reapportionment is the term that refers to the process of allocating representatives to districts. So we have 31 districts in the Senate, 150 in the House, and so the process of deciding where these go across the state is reapportionment. Redistricting is the term that refers to the drawing of district boundary lines. And so we're going to see that there are some significant controversies that are involved in this reapportionment and redistricting process. So after the last census in 2010, and we are actually moving into a new census in 2020, but after the last census in 2010, each state senator represented about 811,147 people. We saw that in one of our previous lectures. And each state House member represented about 167,637 people. But in order to decide this and get to this situation, a highly political process occurred. And the political process will include interest groups that get involved to try to gain as much power as possible in the reapportionment of Senate seats and House seats. Likewise, the majority party is going to try to protect their advantage. So if the Republicans are in power, they're going to try to protect the Republican advantage. If the Democrats are in power, they're going to try to protect the Democratic advantages. Incumbent legislators try to get involved as well because they are trying to ensure their reelection, and they don't want their particular district being drawn into an area that is unfriendly to their reelection. So you've got a whole bunch of different things at issue here. There's a bunch of different people who have their finger in the pie trying to influence this process, and so it becomes extremely political. And the primary issues that arise out of reapportionment and redistricting throughout history are the ideas of equity of representation and minority representation. The third thing is a process called gerrymandering. And so we're going to look at each one of these individually. And so the first problem is this idea of equity of representation. And the equity of representation isn't new. It's as old as the nation itself, and it goes all the way back to the 18th century in Virginia when Thomas Jefferson actually noted the process. Early on, representation was more equal. As populations have shifted over time, though, there have been some issues associated with this because people have moved from rural to urban areas. And so throughout the process, the rural areas have become overrepresented while the urban areas have become underrepresented. And so in Texas history between 1876 and 1920, reapportionment occurred after each census. It was decided by the Constitution that this needed to occur. And so the legislature did what they were supposed to do. But during the 1930s and the 1940s, the legislature didn't bother to reapportion seats. They did not participate in this process. They failed to reapportion legislative seats, and as a consequence, no new seats were added. And so by 1948, the Texas legislative seats had not changed since 1921, despite the fact that there had been some significant population shifts from rural to urban areas as a result of World War I, World War II, etc. And so there became some significant disparities in representation between the rural and urban areas of the state. And this is going to involve a significant underrepresentation of urban counties. Sorry, I just said all that. And so in 1948, there's going to be some action taken to resolve issues associated with representation. And the Legislative Redistricting Board, or the LRB, is going to be established. This board is given the ability to redistrict Senate and House seats, districts, if the legislature fails to do so. And we said that when we talked about the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House, that those individuals would sit on this board and have an enormous power to create these new districts in the event that the legislature failed to do so. And so the board is made up of the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker of the House, the Attorney General, the Comptroller, and the Comptroller, that should be a comma there, and the Commissioner of the General Land Office. So all of these individuals would be responsible for reapportioning seats in the event that the legislature failed to do so. And so this is essentially going to force the hand of the legislature to act in 1951 and 1960 after the federal census. And so the legislature is not going to want to cede power to the Legislative Redistricting Board, so they're going to act. And the urban areas are still going to be severely underrepresented because in 1936 there was an amendment to the Texas State Constitution limiting representatives to only 7 per county until 700,000. Then they could add 1 new representative per 100,000 people. In 1962, there's going to be a Supreme Court decision known as Baker versus Carr, and in this decision, the Supreme Court is going to decide that inequalities in the apportionment of legislative districts denied voters equal protection of the laws. They said that quote, as nearly as practicable, one man's vote, quote, should be, quote, equal to another's. And so we're going to start to see some shifting in regards to how legislative seats in the state of Texas are going to be apportioned because of these Supreme Court decisions. And then 2 years later, Reynolds versus Sims, 1964, requires both chambers to contain about the same number of citizens to promote equity. So in this situation, the court ruled that both houses of the state legislatures had to be apportioned based on population. In addition, state legislative districts needed to be roughly equal in population. So prior to this, population in the Senate was not necessarily looked at, in the state Senate was not necessarily looked at when apportioning seats, because the Senate said that they were mirroring the federal Senate, and they did not apportion their seats according to population. The Supreme Court says that's not a thing because legislators, quote, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. And so legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interests. And so you have to look at population, not just land area, when apportioning Senate seats in state senates. And so they also said that each senator needed to represent roughly the same amount of people as all others, so that one wasn't representing 2 million people and another representing 500,000. Thanks to technology, equity of representation has been a relatively dormant issue in modern time. There have been a couple of things that have been brought up in more recent times, but they have been sort of struck down by the Supreme Court. So by and large, equity of representation, thanks to technology, has become sort of a thing of the past, a little bit of a dormant issue. So that leads us to minority representation. This is the issue that was raised to allow for representation of ethnic minorities. And so one of those three major issues that arise from this process. In 1981, the legislative session produced a plan that advanced minority representation in both houses. But this plan that advanced minority representation was defeated. The Senate plan was vetoed by Governor Bill Clements, and the Texas Supreme Court invalidated the House plan. And so essentially the Legislative Redistricting Board is going to step in and draw new districts and create a new plan. This is going to be challenged in the federal courts by the U.S. Justice Department. They ruled that the plan violated federal voting rights acts because it did not achieve maximum minority representation. African Americans and Hispanics felt that the plan diluted their voting strength. So, a new plan is going to be created by the federal court system, and this essentially maximized minority representation by creating what is known as a majority-minority district. And so in 1990 and 2000, there are going to be some similar battles that are going to be fought, but it does eventually lead to minorities being better represented when reapportioning these seats and redrawing congressional districts. And so the third thing that we see come out of this political process is gerrymandering. And political gerrymandering is the drawing of legislative districts to achieve the political advantage of one political party over another. So there's also this concept of racial gerrymandering, which is the practice of creating districts drawn to the advantage of a minority group. And so there's a couple of different types of gerrymandering that occur. And just a little bit of background information, gerrymandering is going to be named after a Massachusetts governor in the 1800s named Elbridge Gerry. And he is going to be in charge of drawing lines, and as he redraws these lines, one becomes vaguely reminiscent of a salamander. And so there's going to be some political satire that essentially says, you know, look at this area that was drawn by Governor Gerry, and they call it gerrymandering, which over time becomes gerrymandering. Political gerrymandering is going to occur all the time. Republicans are going to charge that Democrats did it when they controlled the state, and now Democrats charge that the Republicans do it when they are in control of the state. And the reality is it probably does happen. It happens all the time in every state legislature. And so it's a thing that occurs. But in 1999, there's going to be a Supreme Court decision known as Hunt versus Cromartie. In 1999, the Supreme Court rules that the race of a group cannot be, race of a group can be a factor of drawing political districts, but it cannot be the primary factor in determining the makeup of a legislative district. And so there is going to be significant gerrymandering, political gerrymandering that occurs, and there is going to be some significant racial gerrymandering that occurs, which has been validated by the Supreme Court in that 1999 ruling. And so as we move forward, we will do probably look at an activity that deals with some of the gerrymandering issues and the redistricting issues that we have seen in Texas history over the past 20 or so years. So we're going to leave it right here, and I'll see you in the next lecture.